In the span of 7 days, Ukraine has just accomplished something that Russia took more than 2 months to achieve, and in the opposite direction. More than 2,000 square kilometers, reclaimed in less than a week. To put that into perspective, this represents the most significant gains recorded by Ukraine since its major counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. But this time, the circumstances are radically different, and the consequences run much deeper than they appear. Because what you've seen in the headlines, liberated villages, Russian forces retreating, shifting lines, that's only the surface. What's really happening behind this operation is far more strategic. Ukraine isn't simply taking back territory, it is dismantling its opponent's plans for next summer, and it's doing so with surgical precision. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it happened now, how Ukraine pulled it off, and most importantly, where all of this is heading. Let's begin. To understand the scale of what just took place, we first need to lay out the geography. The front line in Ukraine stretches roughly 1,100 kilometers. It's a massive line of contact, dotted with combat zones, contested villages, strategic rivers, and defensive positions built over months of effort. For several weeks, Ukrainian forces had identified weaknesses in the opposing defensive setup. Weaknesses that, combined with a major external event, which we'll return to in a few minutes, created a window of opportunity. A short window. Ukraine didn't let it pass. On February 16th, the numbers started coming in. In 1 week, Ukraine had liberated more than a dozen settlements. Not in a single area, in 3 distinct sectors of the front line. A coordinated, multi-axis operation that caught opposing forces completely off guard. The most dramatic gains occurred in the Zaporizhzhia region. There, combined units, infantry, drones, and armored personnel carriers managed to retake 5 villages across a combat strip roughly 30 kilometers wide. The forces holding those positions were forced to retreat, and not just any retreat, they pulled back across the Iduri River. Here's why that matters. That river had taken months for opposing forces to cross in the first place. Months of effort, losses, and resources committed, and in just a few days, all that work was undone. They found themselves right back where they had been last summer. But that wasn't all. On the Alexandriivka axis, Ukrainian forces struck southeast. That maneuver forced opposing units to withdraw from several settlements, including Orestopol and Oleksivka. The movement then set conditions for further advances toward other key points. The military logic is clear. Destabilize the center to threaten the flanks. Another river entered the picture in that sector, the Yanker. Ukrainian forces advanced along its course, retaking a series of settlements one after another, a domino effect. One position falls, that exposes the next, which then falls in turn. Further north of Huliapol, a parallel offensive targeted the same Iduri River. Ukrainian forces successfully crossed it, pushing opposing positions back to the other bank. 2 additional settlements returned to Ukrainian control. Meanwhile, on yet another axis, Ukraine launched an operation in an area held by the opposing 58th Combined Arms Army. In this sector, the goal was not necessarily large-scale territorial recovery, but rather to fix enemy forces in place, prevent them from redeploying elsewhere, and halt their own assaults. The result? Enemy attacks in several zones stopped outright. And when your opponent stops attacking, new opportunities open up. Now let's look at the raw numbers. Across all the areas where counterattacks occurred, Ukraine regained approximately 9.5 kilometers in depth. That alone is notable. But in terms of total area, France 24 reported a far more striking figure, more than 2,011 square kilometers reclaimed in under a week. To give you an idea, that's comparable to a major metropolitan area, recovered in 7 days.
The last time Ukraine achieved gains of that magnitude was during its summer 2023 counteroffensive, but that operation mobilized enormous resources over several months, with the explicit objective of reclaiming as much territory as possible. What just happened is fundamentally different, and understanding why reveals just how much smarter this operation is than it appears. We'll get there, but first we need to talk about the trigger, because without it, none of this would have been possible at that moment. Everything shifted around February 8th. That date is not insignificant. It's precisely when opposing forces lost access to illicit Starlink terminals they had been using in the field, and that loss triggered a cascade effect many hadn't anticipated. Starlink, for those unfamiliar, is a low Earth orbit satellite network developed by a private American company. It provides high-speed internet in areas where ground infrastructure is non-existent or destroyed. On a battlefield, that translates to real-time communication between units, command structures, and weapons systems. Opposing forces were using these terminals for multiple purposes. First, for basic communication between frontline units and command. Second, to guide certain medium and long-range drones, including those used to strike distant targets. When that connectivity was cut, the consequences were immediate. Some analysts initially focused on the drone aspect, and that's partially true. Several enemy drone systems depended on that connectivity. But according to Preston Stewart, whose analysis of this breakthrough was widely cited, that's not where the most devastating impact occurred. The most devastating impact was on tactical battlefield communications. Here's why that matters. The opposing strategy in 2025 and into 2026 relied heavily on infiltration tactics. Small units, sometimes just a few dozen men, were sent to discreetly penetrate areas their side claimed but did not fully control. They would dig in, occupy buildings, trenches, forest edges, and wait. They depended entirely on communication with command for three essential things: where to go, what exactly their mission was, and whether reinforcements were coming. Without Starlink, those communications disappeared, not partially, almost entirely. What that meant on the ground, small groups of soldiers isolated, without clear orders, without coordination, unsure if anyone was coming to support them. All they could do was hide in precarious positions and hope not to be discovered. Ukraine saw this and acted at precisely the right moment. From February 8th onward, enemy advances in several directions nearly stopped cold. Ukraine immediately read the signal. Instead of waiting, it struck. This timing was not random. It was precise situational awareness. Ukraine recognized that its opponent had suddenly become blind and deaf across portions of its force structure, and it launched operations exactly where that vulnerability was greatest. But Starlink alone doesn't explain the scale of what followed. There was a second factor, equally decisive, a tactical innovation developed by Ukraine itself.
Much has been said about weapons and equipment deliveries, but what's truly changing the battlefield is something less visible, a new tactical doctrine. Ukraine developed a specific response to gray zones and infiltration tactics. Preston Stewart describes it as unprecedented. Here's how it works. Small units are formed with a precise mission: locate and destroy infiltrated enemy groups. These units are light, typically platoon-sized, between 12 and 20 soldiers. They are not trying to hold lines or conduct deep breakthroughs. They are hunting. Their effectiveness relies on precise intelligence. Before entering an area, they receive detailed briefings: which buildings are occupied, approximately how many individuals are present, their exact geographic objective. Advance to this point, clear this zone, stop, regroup. It's not a reckless charge. It's methodical, sequential, minimizing Ukrainian risk while maximizing enemy losses. And it is devastating against infiltration tactics, because infiltration relies on occupying ground without truly defending it.
Lightly armed units depend on surprise and disorientation. When confronted by units specifically tasked with hunting and eliminating them, the balance flips entirely. A spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces, Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, summarized it bluntly: "We hunt down the flag planters and destroy them." The phrase flag planters is revealing. It refers to units that enter a village, symbolically plant their presence, and wait for command to turn that foothold into a defensive line. Ukraine decided that waiting period would no longer exist. Voloshin added, "These zones were and remain under our control, never under the enemy's. We find infiltrators and destroy them." That message is both military and political. Ukraine refuses to validate the narrative that certain areas had changed hands. In its framing, these are clearing operations in areas never truly lost. The combination of two factors, the communication blackout and the hunter-killer units, created the conditions for an exceptional week on the battlefield. But now the real question: why? What is the ultimate objective? Because if you think this was just about reclaiming territory, you're only seeing half the picture. Before diving into Ukraine's strategy, let's pause for a moment and look at what's happening on the opposing side. Because the way a military reacts to a setback often reveals as much as battlefield reports themselves. The first official reaction was silence. The Ministry of Defense did not communicate about the territorial losses. No announcement, no explanation, no acknowledgement of retreats. That vacuum was filled by military bloggers and independent commentators who attempted to justify or explain what had just happened. Most of these commentators ultimately reported something close to the reality of the situation, according to Stewart. The retreats were acknowledged, the losses were admitted, but the tone remained one of minimization. One of the more influential commentators in that sphere, Yuri Podolaka, attempted to frame the Ukrainian operation as a failure. His argument: Ukraine had been stopped along the entire front. The results were not proportional to the objectives. Ukrainian losses were too heavy for this to be considered a success. Stewart dismantles that argument point by point. First, Podolaka appears to be comparing this operation to the massive summer 2023 counteroffensive, an operation explicitly aimed at deep breakthroughs and major territorial recovery. That is not what Ukraine was attempting here. Second, Podolaka's claims contradict those of his fellow military bloggers, who openly acknowledge the retreats and losses. There is internal inconsistency that reflects disorganized communication. Perhaps most revealing is the narrative itself. When a military power loses ground and its first reaction is denial or minimization, it often signals that the situation is more serious than it wants to admit. Commanders who boasted about territorial gains have to explain how that ground was lost. Soldiers who fought for months under difficult conditions have seen their gains erased in days. That's a psychological shock as much as a military one. And that brings us directly to the strategic question. Podolaka makes a fundamental analytical error. He measures this operation against the objectives he assumes it had. But Ukraine's real objectives lie elsewhere, and they are far more calculated.
The key word in this operation is one you rarely hear in surface-level military analysis: stabilization. Ukraine did not launch these counterattacks to stage a show of force. It wasn't seeking a media moment. It wasn't launching a large territorial reconquest campaign. It was seeking to stabilize the front. Why is that so important? Observers at the Institute for the Study of War noted that Ukraine deliberately limited its operations to what's called the tactical or gray zone, areas of direct frontline contact, without pushing deep into enemy rear areas. An analyst cited by the Institute, Konstantin Mashevets, put it clearly: Ukraine is not trying to consolidate, It is trying to stabilize the most chaotic sectors of the front in the Zaporizhzhia region. The distinction matters. To consolidate would mean turning each reclaimed village into a permanent fortress, anchoring troops, building deep defensive lines immediately. To stabilize means eliminating gray zones, clearing infiltrators, clarifying who controls what, and creating more readable, manageable front lines. Why now? Why the urgency? Because the opponent is preparing a major summer offensive, and Ukraine is fully aware of it. Part 6. The coming summer offensive, the real stakes. The Institute for the Study of War reported that the opposing side is indeed preparing a major offensive for next summer. Part of it would focus on the Zaporizhzhia axis, precisely where these Ukrainian operations took place. Details that have emerged are concerning. The Kiev Post reports that approximately 100,000 soldiers could be committed to this operation. These troops would come from strategic reserves built up since 2025, resources set aside for a decisive strike. Internal deadlines were reportedly imposed, tight deadlines. But before launching such an offensive, the ground had to be prepared. Forward lines had to be advanced enough to threaten strategic objectives. And this is where everything connects. Ukraine has just dismantled those starting positions. Villages that took months to seize, positions meant to serve as launch points for the summer offensive, have disappeared in a week. Mashevets stated on February 5th that everything Ukraine does to delay the offensive reduces the window of opportunity for territorial gains. Summer offers favorable offensive conditions, solid ground, vegetation cover, reduced risk of hypothermia. But that window is limited. Ukraine has now narrowed it further. The opponent now faces a strategic dilemma with no good solution. Option 1, do not use strategic reserves to retake lost ground. Preserve the 100,000 troops for the planned summer offensive. But then the offensive begins from weaker positions against strengthened Ukrainian defenses. Option 2, use part of the reserves now to retake the lost territory. But every soldier and vehicle used now is one less available for summer. And retaking fortified positions will be costly. This is the classic attrition dilemma. Ukraine has forced its opponent into choosing between two unfavorable paths. Either way, Ukraine gains leverage. To truly grasp what's happening, we need to explain the gray zone concept that has dominated this conflict for months. Traditionally, positional warfare involved clearly defined lines. Each side controlled territory behind its line. Combat shifted that line forward or backward. In this conflict, that logic has partially been replaced by something far more ambiguous. Infiltration tactics have created zones where neither side can claim full control. Small enemy groups may operate hundreds of meters behind what is considered the front line. Drones from both sides operate over the same terrain. The enemy might be behind you, beside you, or nowhere visible. These gray zones pose serious problems. They require constant clearing operations. They create confusion in command chains. They prevent durable fortification because control is uncertain. Ukraine prefers stable lines, clearly controlled territory, clean combat boundaries. That is precisely what this series of operations seeks to create. By eliminating infiltrators, reclaiming anchor villages, and clarifying control across dozens of kilometers, Ukraine is doing something that raw territorial numbers don't fully capture. It is changing the nature of combat in this region. And once gray zones are eliminated, something critical becomes possible: fortification. Part 8. Fortification, the next phase. The reclaimed territories will not remain as they are. They will be transformed. Now that Ukraine clearly controls these villages and riverbanks, it can fortify them, turn them into defensive nodes, create hardened positions the opponent must attack head-on to retake. But Ukraine intends more than defense. It aims to create kill zones. Stewart describes it concretely. Along the new front line and up to 15 kilometers deep, destruction zones will be established, areas under constant drone surveillance, covered by pre-registered artillery fire, monitored by sensors, any movement detected, any infiltration immediately targeted. An enemy attempting to retake this ground this summer will not face isolated light units. It will face integrated, coordinated defenses. The human cost will be significant. Euronews noted that the opponent was already struggling to secure staging points for its summer offensive. Ukraine has removed several of them. They are now becoming the very fortifications that will decimate troops trying to reclaim them. There is ruthless logic here. 1 week of offensive operations to set conditions for months of defensive advantage. Strategic engineering.
There may be one final piece to this phase of operations before Ukraine shifts fully into fortification mode. The village of Uspanivka. According to Stewart, it could be the next objective. Geographically and logistically, it makes sense. Uspanivka sits at the center of the opposing defensive network in this sector, likely a logistical node, a convergence point for supply and communication lines supporting operations in Zaporizhzhia. Taking it would sever vital arteries. The village has been under opposing control since early November. It has been used to block Ukrainian units to the north. Losing it would be painful, symbolically and militarily. If taken, it would likely mark the end of this counteroffensive phase. After that, Ukraine would shift toward consolidation, fortification, and preparation. This sequencing is not accidental. Each objective sets conditions for the next. Each reclaimed village exposes the next defensive node. Each river crossed opens new avenues. It reflects remarkable operational planning and adaptation. Stepping back from tactical details, what does this truly mean? First, it shows how vulnerabilities in enemy systems can have cascading effects. The loss of illicit satellite communications reshaped an entire week of combat. It highlights the fragility of modern communication systems and growing reliance on civilian technologies in warfare. Second, it confirms that tactical innovation is a force multiplier. Without numerical superiority, Ukraine achieved results that caught its opponent off guard through adaptation developed in real time. Third, perhaps most important, this week should be understood as a strategic investment, not an end in itself. Ukraine reclaimed territory not for headlines, but for positional advantage in the months ahead. Fourth, it places the opponent in a structurally difficult position heading into summer. Strategic reserves risk being partially consumed before the planned offensive even begins. Timelines disrupted, launch positions erased. Fifth, the psychological dimension matters. Commanders must explain losses. Soldiers see months of sacrifice undone. Confidence erodes.